Welcome everyone. Today we're diving into an extraordinary journey of friendship, compassion, and the power of simple acts of kindness. Our story follows a young boy named Chris, who on what seemed like an ordinary day, took a path that would forever change his life and the life of his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Garcia. From happy beginnings to moments of sadness, from challenges that test their strength to the heartwarming connection they build, this story is sure to touch your heart. Before we begin, if you aren't subscribed yet, I highly recommend you subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of my videos. Now, let's get started. Chris coasted down the familiar neighborhood street, the afternoon sun casting golden hues across the pavement as the gentle wind tousled his hair. These peaceful, carefree bike rides through his community always filled his heart with a sense of belonging and contentment. As he turned onto Maple Street, a subtle movement caught his attention, drawing his gaze toward a quaint, yellow house nestled behind a meticulously maintained garden. There, in front of the cozy home, stood Mrs. Garcia, the elderly woman who had always treated Chris with kindness and warmth. But today, something was different. Her usually bright and welcoming demeanor was overshadowed by frustration as she struggled with an old television set on her lawn. Her once lively eyes now seemed clouded with worry, and her hands shook slightly as she fumbled with the stubborn device. Chris felt a pang of concern for the woman who had often greeted him with a gentle smile and, on occasion, a batch of freshly baked cookies. It pained him to see her in such a state. Over the past few weeks, he'd noticed a change in her. She seemed more reclusive, spending less time nurturing the beautiful roses that adorned her front yard, and more time lost in her own thoughts. Something had shifted in Mrs. Garcia's world, and it troubled Chris deeply. Without a moment's hesitation, Chris veered his bike toward her house, his heart compelled by a deep sense of empathy. As he approached, he could hear her muttering under her breath, the frustration evident in her trembling voice. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Garcia," Chris said gently, his voice laced with concern as he tried not to startle her. "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Garcia looked up, her face a tapestry of surprise and fatigue. "Oh, Chris, it's you," she replied, her voice a mix of warmth and despair. "This old television just stopped working, and I was so looking forward to watching my show today. But it seems like this might be the end of the line for it," she added with a resigned sigh, her eyes reflecting the hopelessness she felt. Chris's heart ached for her. He knew how much joy those afternoon shows brought her. They were often the highlight of her day. He couldn't bear to see her so distressed, and a surge of determination welled up inside him. "Maybe I can help," he offered, dismounting his bike and stepping closer to the TV. "I'm pretty handy with electronics. Would it be okay if I take a look?" A glimmer of hope flickered in Mrs. Garcia's tired eyes, and she nodded, a small, grateful smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "That would be wonderful, Chris. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it." As Chris knelt beside the television, he could feel the weight of Mrs. Garcia's gaze on him. It wasn't just a broken TV that needed fixing, he realized. The frail woman before him needed more someone to care, someone to be there when the world felt too heavy to bear alone. He understood then that this was about more than just a good deed. It was about offering a piece of his heart to someone who needed it. Chris knelt beside the old television, his youthful eyes intently scanning the intricate maze of components on the back panel. Mrs. Garcia hovered anxiously nearby, her frail hands twisting together in a nervous dance. "Don't worry, Mrs. Garcia," Chris reassured her, his voice gentle and comforting. He flashed her a warm, confident smile. "I'll do everything I can to get this working for you." With steady, careful hands, Chris began his work. He meticulously checked the cords, ensuring each one was securely connected before carefully removing the back panel to expose the labyrinth of wires and circuits inside. Despite his age, There was a surprising calmness in his demeanor, a quiet determination that shone through as he examined the old TV with a focus far beyond his years. Garcia watched in awe, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and admiration for this young boy who had stepped up to help her in her time of need. His fingers moved with a surety that belied his youth, and she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of warmth spread through her chest, touched by his unexpected kindness. After several minutes of concentrated effort, Chris leaned back on his heels, his brow furrowed in thought. "I think I've found the issue," he announced, his voice steady. "There's a loose connection here. If I can just..." He trailed off, leaning in closer to reconnect a tiny, wayward wire. His tongue peeked out in concentration, a habit from childhood, as he focused entirely on the task at hand. Then, with a crackle, the television sprang to life. The screen flickered before stabilizing into a clear, steady picture. "Mrs." Garcia gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in astonishment. "Oh, my stars," she exclaimed, her voice quivering with joy. "You did it, Chris. You really did it." A radiant smile spread across Chris's face as he stood up, brushing the dust from his hands onto his jeans. "It wasn't too tough," he said with modesty, though a deep sense of pride surged within him. "I'm just glad I could help." Tears of gratitude shimmered in Mrs. Garcia's eyes as she looked at Chris, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much, Chris," she murmured, her voice trembling. "You don't know how much this means to me. This television, it was a gift from my late husband. I thought I had lost that connection to him forever." A lump formed in Chris's throat, the weight of her words hitting him hard. He hadn't realized just how much this old TV meant to her. Now, knowing he had restored not just a piece of electronics but a cherished memory, made the success of the repair all the sweeter. A spark of inspiration suddenly lit up Mrs. Garcia's face. "Oh, I know. You must come inside and have some cookies. I baked a fresh batch this morning. It's the least I can do to show my gratitude." Chris's eyes lit up at the thought of cookies, his mouth already watering at the prospect. "That sounds wonderful, Mrs. Garcia. Thank you so much." As they walked toward the house, Mrs. Garcia gently placed a hand on Chris's shoulder, her touch light but full of affection. "You're a very special young man, Chris," she said softly, her voice brimming with emotion. "Your parents must be incredibly proud of you." A warm glow of happiness filled Chris as they stepped into the cozy kitchen. Today he hadn't just repaired a TV, he had brought joy back into Mrs. Garcia's life, and that sense of fulfillment was far more rewarding than any electronic fix. Seated at the kitchen table, Chris's eyes widened with delight as Mrs. Garcia set a plate of warm, gooey chocolate chip cookies before him. The sweet aroma wafted through the room, making his mouth water. "Here you go, dear Mrs. Garcia said, placing a glass of cold milk beside the cookies with a smile that was full of warmth and affection. "Enjoy." Chris eagerly took a big bite, savoring the melted chocolate that coated his tongue. "These are amazing, Mrs. Garcia," he exclaimed, his voice muffled by the delicious mouthful. Mrs. Garcia chuckled, her eyes sparkling with joy. "I'm so glad you like them, Chris. It's been a long time since I've had someone to bake for." The afternoon sun continued to bathe the room in a warm glow, but it was the shared moments of kindness and connection that made the day truly shine. As they savored their snack, Mrs. Garcia began to open up, sharing memories that seemed to flow like a gentle stream, carrying her back to the days when her house was filled with laughter and love. She spoke tenderly of her late husband, a courageous police officer who had dedicated his life to protecting their community. As she recounted tales of his bravery and kindness, her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and Chris felt a deep pang of empathy in his heart. "It's been so quiet since he passed away, Mrs. Garcia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes this house feels so empty without him. Chris listened closely, the weight of her loneliness settling heavily in his young chest. He could see the sadness etched into the lines of her face, the kind of sorrow that only time and solitude can create. His heart ached for her, and in that moment, he wished he could do more than just fix a TV or share a plate of cookies. "I'm really sorry you've been feeling lonely, Mrs. Garcia," Chris said softly, reaching out to pat her hand with a gentle, comforting touch. "That must be really hard to deal with." "Mrs." Garcia smiled at him, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "You're such a kind boy, Chris. Your visit today has brought a little sunshine back into my life." Chris's heart swelled with happiness at her words, a warm glow spreading through him like a cozy blanket on a cold day. He was glad he could bring a bit of joy into Mrs. Garcia's life, even if it was just through a simple act of kindness and a shared moment over cookies. As they finished their snack, Mrs. Garcia's face brightened with a sudden thought. "You know, Chris," she began, her voice filled with a hopeful tone, "you're welcome to visit anytime you like. I always have fresh cookies, and I'd love to have some company." Chris's face lit up with a wide grin. "Really? That would be awesome, Mrs. Garcia. I'd love to come visit you again." Mrs. Garcia reached out and gently squeezed Chris's hand, her touch conveying the deep appreciation she felt. "You've brought so much joy into this old house today, Chris. Thank you for that." As Chris pedaled his bike home, his heart felt light, and his spirits soared like never before. The warm afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the quiet suburban streets as he turned into his driveway. He couldn't wait to tell his parents about his afternoon with Mrs. Garcia, feeling as if he had made a new friend in the most unexpected way. Walking through the front door, Chris was greeted by the comforting aroma of his mom's homemade lasagna wafting through the air. "Mom, Dad, I'm home," he called out, his voice bubbling with excitement. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson emerged from the kitchen, smiles spreading across their faces as they saw the joy radiating from their son. "Welcome home, sweetheart," Mrs. Johnson said warmly, wiping her hands on her apron. "How was your bike ride?" Chris could hardly contain his enthusiasm as he launched into his story. "It was great. I helped Mrs. Garcia fix her TV, and then she invited me in for cookies." Mr. Johnson raised his eyebrows in pleasant surprise. "Mrs. Garcia from down the street? That was very thoughtful of you, son." Chris nodded eagerly, his eyes shining with pride. "Yeah, she was trying to carry the TV out to the curb, but I offered to take a look at it. It wasn't too hard to fix." Mrs. Johnson's eyes sparkled with pride as she looked at her son. "That's wonderful, Chris. I'm sure Mrs. Garcia really appreciated your help." "She did," Chris replied, his voice softening with empathy. "She seemed kind of lonely. I think she was just happy to have someone to talk to." In that moment, Chris realized that his day had been about so much more than fixing a television. It was about connecting with someone who needed a friend, and the profound impact that a simple act of kindness can have on another person's life. Mr. Johnson placed a firm hand on Chris's shoulder, his expression full of pride and warmth. "You did a really good thing today, son. Helping others, especially our neighbors, is something we should all strive to do. It's what builds a strong, supportive community." Mrs. Johnson nodded in agreement, her eyes soft with affection. "That's right, Chris. It's especially important to look out for our elderly neighbors. They often need a little extra help and companionship, and what you did meant the world to Mrs. Garcia." Chris felt a glowing sense of pride radiate through his chest. Knowing that his parents approved of his actions made him feel even better about the small act of kindness he had shown. "Mrs. Garcia said I could visit her anytime," he said, his voice hopeful. Is that okay with you guys?" His parents exchanged a knowing, pleased look before Mr. Johnson nodded. "Of course it is, Chris. We're very proud of you for reaching out to Mrs. Garcia. You've shown real kindness and compassion today, and that's something to be admired." The next morning, Chris woke up with a sense of purpose, eager to visit Mrs. Garcia again. After a quick breakfast, he hopped on his bike, his heart brimming with anticipation as he pedaled down the familiar street. As he approached Mrs. Garcia's house, he spotted her in the front yard, tending to her vibrant flower garden. Her face lit up with a warm, welcoming smile when she noticed him coming. "Chris, what a lovely surprise, Mrs. Garcia called out, waving her gardening gloves with delight. Chris parked his bike and walked over to her, a broad smile on his face. "Hi, Mrs. Garcia. I just wanted to check on you and see how the TV's working." Mrs. Garcia's eyes twinkled with joy. "Oh, it's working perfectly, dear. You did such a marvelous job. Would you like to come inside for a bit?" Chris nodded enthusiastically. "Sure, I'd love to." They made their way into the cozy living room, where the television sat proudly on its stand, a reminder of the connection they had forged. Mrs. Garcia gestured for Chris to take a seat on the floral-patterned sofa. "Can I get you something to drink? Maybe some lemonade," she offered kindly. "That sounds great." "Thank you," Chris replied, his manners impeccable. As Mrs. Garcia moved about the kitchen, preparing the lemonade, Chris took in the room around him. His eyes were drawn to a series of framed photographs on a nearby shelf. They depicted a younger Mrs. Garcia, standing proudly beside a man in a police uniform. The love and happiness captured in those moments were palpable, even years later. When Mrs. Garcia returned with 2 glasses of lemonade, Chris couldn't help but ask, "Is that your husband in the photos?" Mrs. Garcia's smile turned soft and wistful, a bittersweet mix of love and longing in her eyes. "Yes, that's my Robert," she said, her voice gentle. "He was a police officer for over 30 years. He passed away 5 years ago." Chris felt a deep pang of sadness for the kind woman sitting beside him. "I'm really sorry, Mrs. Garcia. He looks like he was a great man." "He was," she replied softly, her voice full of fondness. "The kindest, bravest soul I ever knew." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, sipping their lemonade, the room filled with a shared sense of understanding and respect. Then Mrs. Garcia's face brightened, a spark of excitement in her eyes. "How about we watch some TV together? There's a lovely nature show on right now." Chris nodded eagerly, and Mrs. Garcia turned on the television. As the screen came to life with images of colorful birds flitting through lush forests, they settled into a relaxed conversation. They chatted about the animals, sharing little facts they knew, their voices mingling with the gentle sounds of the show. The afternoon passed in a blur of laughter and stories. Chris found himself opening up about school and his hobbies, while Mrs. Garcia shared tales from her younger days, stories of adventure, love, and the joys of a life well lived. The hours slipped away unnoticed, the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon. As the sky outside the window turned a soft shade of orange, Chris realized it was time to head home. "I should probably get going, Mrs. Garcia. Thank you for having me over." Mrs. Garcia smiled warmly, her heart full from the day's visit. "Thank you for coming, Chris. You've brought so much joy into this old house. You're welcome here anytime." Chris stood up, feeling a sense of fulfillment that went beyond anything he had experienced before. As he rode his bike home, the evening air cool against his skin, he knew he had made a special connection with Mrs. Garcia, a bond that went far beyond fixing a television. It was the beginning of a friendship that would bring light to both their lives. Mrs. Garcia patted his hand gently, her touch warm and comforting. "Thank you for coming, Chris. You've brightened my day more than you know." As the days turned into weeks, Chris's visits to Mrs. Garcia's home became a cherished part of his routine. Every few days after school, he would eagerly hop on his bike and pedal down the familiar street, his heart brimming with anticipation for the time he would spend with her. Mrs. Garcia always greeted him with the same warmth and affection, her face lighting up the moment she saw him. "There's my favorite young man," she would exclaim, her eyes sparkling with joy as she opened her arms wide to welcome him. They soon settled into a comfortable rhythm, each visit bringing a sense of connection that both deeply cherished. They spent their afternoons in Mrs. Garcia's cozy living room, the atmosphere filled with the soft hum of companionship. Some days they would watch TV together, laughing at old shows or marveling at nature documentaries. On other days, they simply sat and talked, sharing stories that bridged the gap between their generations. Chris found himself looking forward to these visits more and more, drawn to the warmth and wisdom that Mrs. Garcia offered so freely. One sunny afternoon, as they sat sipping lemonade, Mrs. Garcia reached for an old photo album tucked away on a nearby shelf. "I thought you might like to see some pictures from when I was young," she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia and a hint of excitement. Chris leaned in closer, his curiosity piqued as he flipped open the album to reveal a collection of black and white photos. "Wow, Mrs. Garcia, is that really you?" he asked, his eyes wide with surprise as he pointed to a picture of a young woman in a beautiful dress. Mrs. Garcia chuckled, a soft, melodic sound that spoke of fond memories. "Yes, that's me on my wedding day. I was just 22 years old." As they continued to flip through the pages, Mrs. Garcia began to share stories from her past, each one a window into a different time. She spoke of growing up during simpler times, of meeting her beloved Robert at a dance, and of the many adventures they had embarked on together. "Robert and I traveled all over the country in our little camper van," she said, her eyes distant and filled with the light of those long-ago memories. "Those were some of the happiest days of my life." Chris listened with rapt attention, his imagination painting vivid pictures of what it must have been like to live through those times. He found himself captivated by her stories, each one a lesson in life and love, and in return he began to open up to Mrs. Garcia about his own dreams and aspirations. "I want to be an engineer when I grow up," he confided one afternoon, his voice full of determination. "I love fixing things and figuring out how they work." Mrs. Garcia nodded approvingly, her smile filled with pride. "That's wonderful, Chris. You certainly have a talent for it. I wouldn't be surprised if you invent something amazing one day." Chris beamed at her words of encouragement, a warm glow spreading through him. "Do you really think so?" "I know so, Mrs. Garcia replied with a gentle smile, her voice brimming with confidence in him. "You've got a bright future ahead of you, young man." As the weeks passed, the bond between them grew stronger. Chris found in Mrs. Garcia a patient listener, a wise advisor who guided him with gentle words and understanding. In turn, Mrs. Garcia discovered in Chris a source of youthful energy, a beacon of hope that brightened her days and filled her heart with renewed joy for the future. One evening, as the Johnson family gathered around the dinner table, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson exchanged knowing glances. They had noticed how Chris's face always seemed to light up when he returned from Mrs. Garcia's house, his eyes alight with excitement as he shared stories of their time together. "So, Chris, Mr. Johnson began, a smile playing on his lips. "You've been spending a lot of time with Mrs. Garcia lately. How's she doing?" Chris looked up, his face glowing with enthusiasm. "She's doing great, Dad. We've been spending a lot of time together and she's been telling me all these amazing stories about when she was younger. She even showed me pictures from her wedding day. Mrs. Johnson smiled warmly, pride evident in her eyes as she listened to her son speak. That sounds wonderful, Chris. It's so nice that you've been keeping her company. I'm sure she really appreciates having you around. Chris nodded eagerly, his heart full. Yeah, she told me that I've brought a lot of joy back into her life. And honestly, I think she's done the same for me. I didn't realize how much I could learn from someone like her. Mr. Johnson reached over and gave Chris's shoulder a gentle squeeze. You're doing something really special, son. Building that connection with Mrs. Garcia is something you'll both treasure for a long time. As Chris continued to share more about his afternoons with Mrs. Garcia, the Johnsons couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride in their son. His kindness, compassion, and genuine care for his elderly neighbor were qualities that would serve him well in life, and they knew that these visits were shaping him in ways they hadn't expected. The family finished their dinner, the room filled with warmth and the quiet contentment that comes from knowing that, in their own way, they were helping to build a community grounded in love, respect, and mutual support. Chris's face lit up with excitement as he recounted his latest visit with Mrs. Garcia. She's great, Dad. Today she showed me old photos from when she was young. Did you know she and her husband traveled all over the country in a camper van? Mrs. Johnson chuckled softly, a smile spreading across her face. That sounds like quite an adventure. It's wonderful that she's sharing those memories with you. As Chris continued to talk animatedly about his afternoons spent with Mrs. Garcia, his parents listened with rapt attention, their hearts swelling with pride. The joy in Chris's voice was undeniable, and they could see how much these visits meant to him. When there was a brief pause in the conversation, Mr. Johnson cleared his throat, his voice filled with warmth and sincerity. You know, son, he began, your mother and I are really proud of you for what you're doing for Mrs. Garcia. Chris looked up from his plate, his eyes wide with surprise. Really? But I'm not doing anything special. I just like spending time with her. Mrs. Johnson reached out and gently squeezed Chris's hand, her touch full of affection. That's exactly what makes it so special, sweetheart. You're making a big difference in her life just by being there for her. Mr. Johnson nodded in agreement, his gaze steady and full of pride. That's right. We've noticed how much happier Mrs. Garcia seems these days. Your friendship means a lot to her, Chris. Chris felt a warm glow spread through his chest at his parents' words. He hadn't really thought about the impact he was having on Mrs. Garcia's life. He just knew he enjoyed their time together. We're so proud of you for recognizing that Mrs. Garcia needed a friend, Mrs. Johnson continued, her eyes shining with emotion. It takes a kind and compassionate heart to reach out to someone like that. Over the next few weeks, Chris found himself spending even more time at Mrs. Garcia's house. Each visit brought new tasks and challenges, and he was always eager to help in any way he could. Their bond deepened with each shared moment, each act of kindness exchanged between them. One sunny afternoon, Chris arrived at Mrs. Garcia's house to find her struggling with a stubborn jar lid. "Oh, Chris," she exclaimed, a look of relief washing over her face. "I'm so glad you're here. These old hands just aren't what they used to be." Chris grinned, taking the jar from her with a confident smile. With a quick twist, he popped the lid off with ease. "There you go, Mrs. Garcia. Easy peasy." Mrs. Garcia's eyes crinkled with warmth and gratitude. "What would I do without you, dear?" As the days went by, Chris became an indispensable part of Mrs. Garcia's daily life. He helped with all sorts of little jobs around the house, changing light bulbs that were too high for her to reach, watering her beloved plants, and even mastering the art of making her favorite tea just the way she liked it. Each task, though small, was done with care and consideration, and Mrs. Garcia's home became a place filled with warmth and companionship. One day, while Chris was helping Mrs. Garcia sort through old photo albums, she paused on a picture of a young boy, his face full of youthful energy and optimism. "That's my late husband when he was about your age," she said softly, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "You remind me so much of him, you know. Always ready to lend a hand, always with a smile on your face." Chris felt a lump form in his throat at her words, a deep sense of connection swelling within him. "Really?" he asked quietly, touched by the comparison. "Mrs. Garcia nodded, her eyes soft with affection. "Yes, really. He was a lot like you, kind. Generous, always thinking of others before himself. You've brought back so many wonderful memories for me, Chris. You've made this house feel like a home again." The sincerity in her voice and the warmth in her eyes made Chris's heart swell with emotion. He realized then that their friendship had grown into something truly special, something that had changed both of their lives for the better. As he looked at the picture of the young boy, knowing now that he had a part in keeping those memories alive, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the bond they shared. From that day forward, Chris continued to visit Mrs. Garcia with even greater enthusiasm, knowing that their time together was more than just a simple act of kindness. It was a gift, one that they both cherished deeply. And as he pedaled home each day, his heart was always a little lighter, knowing that he had made a difference in the life of someone who had become so dear to him. Chris felt a lump form in his throat. "Really?" he asked, his voice soft, touched by the unexpected comparison. Mrs. Garcia nodded, her eyes misty with emotion. "Oh yes, if we'd been blessed with grandchildren, I imagine they might have been just like you." From that moment, something profound shifted in their relationship. Mrs. Garcia began to fuss over Chris like a doting grandmother, always making sure he had a snack when he visited and checking if he was warm enough when the weather turned chilly. Her care was filled with the kind of love and attention that spoke of a bond far deeper than mere neighbors. For Chris, Mrs. Garcia became more than just someone he helped around the house. She was a confidante, someone he could talk to about anything and everything. Whether he was sharing his dreams or worries, she always had a wise word, a funny story, or a comforting piece of advice. He found himself looking forward to their time together more and more, eager to hear about her life experiences and to share his own thoughts and aspirations. As the autumn leaves began to fall, painting the world in shades of red and gold, Chris realized that what had started as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into something truly precious. Mrs. Garcia wasn't just a neighbor anymore, she had become a part of his family. One crisp Saturday morning, inspiration struck Chris. He bounded down the stairs, nearly tripping over his own feet in his excitement. His parents were in the kitchen, enjoying their morning coffee. "Mom, Dad," Chris burst out, his words tumbling over each other in his enthusiasm. "I want you to meet Mrs. Garcia." Mr. Johnson lowered his newspaper, his eyebrows raised in interest. "The neighbor you've been spending so much time with?" Chris nodded eagerly. "Yeah, she's really nice, and I think you'd like her." Mrs. Johnson smiled warmly at her son. "That sounds wonderful, honey. Why don't we go over this afternoon?" Chris's face lit up with joy. "Really? That'd be great." As the afternoon approached, Chris felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. He wanted his parents to like Mrs. Garcia as much as he did, and he hoped that the meeting would go well. When the time came, the Johnson family walked over to Mrs. Garcia's house together, Chris leading the way with eager steps. He knocked on the door, bouncing on his toes with anticipation. When Mrs. Garcia opened it. Her face broke into a wide, welcoming smile. "Chris, what a wonderful surprise." "Hi, Mrs. Garcia," Chris said, beaming with happiness. "I wanted you to meet my parents." Mrs. Garcia's eyes sparkled with delight as she looked at Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. "Oh my, it's so nice to finally meet you. Please come in." As they settled into Mrs. Garcia's cozy living room, Chris watched nervously, but with growing confidence as his parents and Mrs. Garcia began to chat. His worries melted away when he saw his mom laughing at one of Mrs. Garcia's jokes and his dad leaning in to hear a story about her late husband's time as a police officer. Mrs. Johnson turned to Chris, her eyes soft with understanding and affection. "Now I see why you enjoy spending time here so much, sweetie. Mrs. Garcia is absolutely delightful." Mr. Johnson nodded in agreement. "It's wonderful to see how much joy you two bring to each other's lives." Chris felt a warm glow in his chest, a deep sense of contentment settling over him. He glanced at Mrs. Garcia, who winked at him, her eyes twinkling with happiness. In that moment, Chris knew that his two families had become one, bound together by the love and kindness they shared. As the weeks passed, the Johnsons began to include Mrs. Garcia more and more in their family activities. It all started with a simple invitation to Sunday dinner. Mrs. Johnson made the call on a Friday afternoon, her voice warm and inviting. "Mrs. Garcia, we'd love to have you join us for dinner this Sunday. Chris talks about you so much we feel like you're already part of the family." Mrs. Garcia's voice quivered with emotion as she accepted the invitation. "Oh my, that's so kind of you. I'd be delighted." When Sunday arrived, Chris could hardly contain his excitement. He helped his mom set the table, making sure everything was just right for their special guest. The house was filled with the mouth-watering aroma of Mrs. Johnson's famous pot roast and the lively sound of cheerful conversation. During dinner, Mr. Johnson regaled everyone with funny stories from work, his animated gestures bringing laughter to the table. Mrs. Garcia, in turn, shared tales of her adventures with her late husband, her voice soft with nostalgia but bright with the joy of remembered happiness. Chris watched with joy as his parents and Mrs. Garcia laughed together, their conversations flowing effortlessly, as if they had known each other for years. As the evening drew to a close, Chris realized that something beautiful had happened. The lines that separated neighbor from family had blurred completely, leaving in their place a bond that was rich with love, respect, and mutual admiration. Mrs. Garcia was no longer just a neighbor, she was family, and Chris knew that their lives would be forever intertwined in the most wonderful way. The Sunday dinners soon became a regular occurrence, and before long, the Johnsons were including Mrs. Garcia in other family activities too. One sunny Saturday, they invited her to join them for a picnic at the local park. As they spread out their blanket under a shady oak tree, Mrs. Garcia's eyes sparkled with delight. "I haven't been on a picnic in years," she confessed, her voice filled with wonder. Chris helped her settle onto the blanket, making sure she was comfortable. They spent the afternoon eating sandwiches, playing frisbee, with Mrs. Garcia cheering from the sidelines and feeding the ducks at the pond. As the weeks turned into months, Mrs. Garcia became a fixture in the Johnson family's life. She joined them for movie nights, helped Mrs. Johnson tend to her garden, and even came along on a trip to the local museum. With each outing and shared meal, the bond between them grew stronger. For Mrs. Garcia, these moments were like a rebirth. The loneliness that had once consumed her began to fade, replaced by the warmth and love of her newfound family. And for Chris, seeing the joy on Mrs. Garcia's face whenever she was included in their activities filled his heart with happiness. One sunny afternoon, Chris was sprawled on the living room floor, engrossed in his latest electronic project. His fingers deftly maneuvered tiny wires and components as he hummed a cheerful tune. The house was quiet, except for the occasional click of his tools and the soft whirring of the ceiling fan. Suddenly, a sharp knock at the front door broke the peaceful silence. Chris looked up, curiosity etched on his young face. Mr. Johnson, who had been reading the newspaper in his favorite armchair, set aside his paper and stood up. "I'll get it," he called out, making his way to the door. As Mr. Johnson opened the door, Chris craned his neck to see who it was. To his surprise, he saw Mrs. Garcia standing on the porch, but she wasn't alone. Next to her stood a tall police officer in full uniform, his badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. Chris's heart skipped a beat, his mind raced with questions. Why was Mrs. Garcia here with a police officer? Was something wrong? He scrambled to his feet, his project forgotten on the floor. Mr. Johnson's voice carried a note of concern as he greeted their unexpected visitors. "Mrs. Garcia, officer, is everything all right?" "Hey, Mrs. Garcia's face was a mix of emotions: worry, excitement, and something else Chris couldn't quite place. She wrung her hands nervously as she looked up at Mr. Johnson. "Oh, Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm so sorry to bother you like this, but something's happened, and I didn't know who else to turn to." The police officer beside her nodded solemnly, his presence both reassuring and intimidating. Chris inched closer to the door, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Mr. Johnson stepped aside, gesturing for Mrs. Garcia and the police officer to enter. "Please come in," he said, his voice tinged with concern. Mrs. Johnson emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her eyes wide with surprise. Chris stood rooted to the spot, his young mind whirling with questions. He watched as the adults filed into the living room, his stomach knotting with anxiety. What could have happened to bring Mrs. Garcia here with a police officer? "Can I get you anything? Water? Tea?" Mrs. Johnson offered, her hospitable nature kicking in despite the tension in the air. Mrs. Garcia shook her head, her silver hair catching the light. "No, thank you, dear. I'm sorry to intrude like this." The police officer, a tall man with kind eyes, nodded respectfully to the Johnsons. Sir, I'm Officer Ramirez. Mrs. Garcia asked me to accompany her here." Chris inched closer to his parents, seeking comfort in their presence. His father placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but Chris could feel the slight tremor in it. "What's going on, Mr. Johnson asked, his voice calm but laden with worry. "Is everything okay, Mrs. Garcia?" Mrs. Garcia wrung her hands, her eyes darting between the Johnsons and Officer Ramirez. I didn't know who else to turn to," she repeated, her voice quavering. Chris's heart raced. He'd never seen Mrs. Garcia so upset before. In all their afternoons together, she had always been a pillar of strength and wisdom. Seeing her so distressed made him feel scared and helpless. "Maybe we should all sit down, Mrs. Johnson suggested, gently guiding Mrs. Garcia to the couch. The others followed suit, with Chris perching on the armrest next to his mother. Officer Ramirez cleared his throat. "Mrs. Garcia came to the station today with some concerns," he began, his tone professional yet compassionate. Chris looked at Mrs. Garcia, his brow furrowed with worry. She met his gaze, and for a moment, her anxious expression softened. She reached out and patted his hand gently. "Oh, Chris," she said softly. "I'm so sorry to worry you like this. You've been such a wonderful friend to me." The room fell silent, the air heavy with unspoken questions. Chris felt torn between his curiosity to know what was happening and his fear of what Mrs. Garcia might say next. He glanced at his parents, seeing his own confusion mirrored in their faces. Officer Ramirez leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, Chris, I want to assure you that there's no trouble here. No one's in any danger or done anything wrong." A collective sigh of relief filled the room. Chris felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, but his curiosity only grew stronger. "Mrs. Garcia dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Mrs. Johnson had quietly passed to her. "I'm so sorry for alarming you all," she began, her voice trembling. "It's just, well, I've been thinking a lot about my dear Henry lately." Chris knew that Henry was Mrs. Garcia's late husband, a decorated police officer she often spoke fondly of during their afternoon chats. "You see, Mrs. Garcia continued, tears welling up in her eyes. "Today would have been our 50th wedding anniversary." Her voice cracked, and she paused to compose herself. The Johnsons exchanged sympathetic glances while Chris felt a lump forming in his throat. He'd never seen Mrs. Garcia cry before, and it made his heart ache. "I was feeling so alone, Mrs. Garcia went on, "and I found myself at the police station where Henry used to work. That's where I met Officer Ramirez." She gestured toward the kind-faced policeman. Officer Ramirez nodded, a gentle smile on his face. "Mrs. Garcia told me about her husband, about their life together, and about the wonderful friendship she's formed with your family, especially young Chris here." Chris felt a warm glow of pride at the officer's words, but it was quickly overshadowed by concern for Mrs. Garcia. Mrs. Garcia reached out and took Chris's hand in hers. "Chris, you've brought so much joy into my life these past few weeks. You've reminded me what it's like to have family around." She turned to face the Johnsons, her eyes brimming with emotion. "And you've all been so kind, including me in your lives." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I realize today that I don't want to be alone anymore. I hope." Mrs. Garcia's voice faltered, overcome with emotion. Mrs. Garcia took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "My Henry," she began, her voice soft and filled with love, "was a decorated police officer. He spent his whole life helping others, always putting the community first." Chris listened intently, his young heart swelling with admiration for Mrs. Garcia's late husband. He'd heard bits and pieces about Henry before, but never the full story. Henry believed that kindness was the most powerful force in the world. Mrs. Garcia continued, squeezing Chris's hand gently. "He used to say that a single act of kindness could change someone's entire life." The Johnsons nodded, exchanging glances that spoke volumes about their understanding of this simple yet profound truth. Mrs. Garcia turned to Chris, her eyes filled with warmth. "And you, dear Chris, you've proven Henry right. Your kindness, it's filled a void in my heart that I thought would never be whole again." Chris felt a lump forming in his throat, touched by Mrs. Garcia's words. He hadn't realized just how much his simple acts of friendship had meant to her. "When Henry passed away, Mrs. Garcia's voice quivered slightly. "I felt so alone. It was like a part of me had gone with him. But then you came along, Chris, with your bright smile and your willingness to help." She paused, looking around at the Johnsons. "And all of you, welcoming me into your lives. It's been like finding a family again." Officer Ramirez nodded, a gentle smile on his face. "Mrs. Garcia told me how you fixed her TV, Chris, and how that simple act of kindness blossomed into this beautiful friendship. Chris blushed, feeling both proud and humbled. He hadn't thought his actions were anything special, but clearly they had made a huge difference in Mrs. Garcia's life. "You see, Mrs. Garcia continued, her voice growing stronger. "Chris's kindness didn't just fix my TV, it fixed something in me that I thought was broken forever. It reminded me of the joy of connection, of family." Mrs. Garcia's eyes welled up with tears as she continued her story. "You see, Henry and I, we never had children of our own," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent, everyone hanging on her every word. Chris felt a pang in his heart. He'd never known this about Mrs. Garcia, and it made him understand her loneliness even more. After Henry passed, Mrs. Garcia went on, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I felt so alone. The house was so quiet, so empty. I didn't know what to do with myself." Mr. and Mrs. Johnson exchanged sympathetic glances, their hearts going out to their elderly neighbor. Mrs. Garcia turned to Chris, her eyes shining with affection. "But then you came along, Chris. Your visits, your kindness. It's been like a ray of sunshine in my life." Chris felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized just how much his visits had meant to Mrs. Garcia. "Every time you come over, every story we share, every moment we spend together, Mrs. Garcia continued, her voice growing stronger. "It fills my heart with so much joy. It's like having the grandson I never had." Chris's eyes widened at these words. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, a mix of surprise and happiness. Mrs. Garcia reached out and took Chris's hand in hers. "You've become family to me, Chris. You've brought laughter back into my home, purpose back into my days." Chris squeezed her hand gently, feeling the depth of her words. He looked up at his parents, seeing their proud smiles, and then back at Mrs. Garcia. I feel the same way, Mrs. Garcia," Chris said softly. "I love spending time with you. You're like family to me, too." Mrs. Garcia's face lit up with joy, her earlier tears now replaced by a radiant smile. The bond between them, forged through simple acts of kindness, had grown into something beautiful and profound. The police officer, who had been sitting quietly by Mrs. Garcia's side, stepped forward. His eyes were kind, and his smile was gentle as he addressed the Johnson family. "I'm Officer Martinez," he said, his voice warm and reassuring. "I was a close friend of Henry, Mrs. Garcia's late husband." Chris looked up at the officer, curiosity filling his eyes. He could see the respect and admiration in Officer Martinez's face as he spoke about Mrs. Garcia's husband. "Henry was one of the finest officers I've ever known," Officer Martinez continued. "He dedicated his life to helping others and making our community a better place." Mrs. Garcia nodded, a proud smile on her face as she remembered her husband. "That's right," she said softly. "Henry always believed in giving back to the community." Officer Martinez turned to Chris, his expression serious but kind. "Mrs. Garcia has told me all about you, Chris, about how you've been helping her and keeping her company. It's exactly the kind of thing Henry would have loved to see." Chris felt a mix of emotions, pride, happiness, and a touch of shyness at being the center of attention. He hadn't realized his simple acts of kindness would mean so much to so many people. "You see," Officer Martinez explained, "Mrs. Garcia wants to honor Henry's legacy, and she believes the best way to do that is by supporting you, Chris." Chris's eyes widened in surprise. He looked at Mrs. Garcia, who was smiling at him with tears in her eyes. "That's right, dear Mrs. Garcia said, her voice filled with emotion. "Henry always believed in investing in the future, in helping young people reach their full potential. And that's exactly what I want to do for you, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson listened intently, their faces a mix of surprise and gratitude. They hadn't expected this turn of events when Mrs. Garcia and Officer Martinez had arrived at their door. Mrs. Garcia has set up a college fund for you, Chris, Officer Martinez explained. She wants to make sure you have the opportunity to pursue your dreams, just like Henry would have wanted. Chris was stunned. He looked from Officer Martinez to Mrs. Garcia, then to his parents, trying to process this incredible news. The kindness he had shown, the friendship he had offered, was coming back to him in ways he could never have imagined. Officer Martinez reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. With a warm smile, he handed it to Chris. "Mrs. Garcia asked me to give this to you," he said gently. Chris's hands trembled slightly as he took the envelope. He looked at Mrs. Garcia, who nodded encouragingly, her eyes brimming with tears of joy. "Go ahead, dear Mrs." Garcia said softly. "Read it." Chris carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. As he began to read, his eyes widened and his mouth fell open in astonishment. "Dear Chris," the letter began, "your kindness and compassion have touched my heart in ways I never thought possible. You've brought light back into my life, reminding me of the goodness that still exists in this world." Chris's parents leaned in, listening intently as their son read the letter aloud. Mrs. Johnson placed a comforting hand on her husband's shoulder, both of them overwhelmed by the generosity they were witnessing. "To honor my husband's memory and to ensure that your bright spirit continues to shine, I've decided to set up a scholarship fund in your name," Chris read, his voice quivering with emotion. "This fund will provide you with the means to pursue your dreams, whatever they may be." Mrs. Garcia smiled softly, watching as Chris absorbed the news. "I want you to have every opportunity to make a difference in this world, just as you've made a difference in mine," the letter continued. Chris looked up from the letter, his eyes meeting Mrs. Garcia's. I don't know what to say," he whispered, overcome with gratitude. Officer Martinez stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Chris's shoulder. "You don't have to say anything, son. Your actions have spoken louder than words ever could." Chris lowered the letter, his hands shaking slightly. He looked up at Mrs. Garcia, his eyes glistening with tears. The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of her generosity settled over everyone. Mrs. Johnson was the first to break the silence. "Oh, Mrs. Garcia," she said, her voice thick with emotion. It's just incredible." "Mr. Johnson nodded in agreement, wiping a tear from his eye. "We don't know how to thank you for this," he added, his voice barely above a whisper. Chris stood up slowly, the letter clutched tightly in his hand. He walked over to Mrs. Garcia, who opened her arms wide. Without hesitation, Chris fell into her embrace, burying his face in her shoulder as tears streamed down his cheeks. "Thank you," Chris mumbled into Mrs. Garcia's sweater. "Thank you so much." Mrs. Garcia patted Chris's back gently, her own tears falling freely now. "No, my dear boy," she said softly. "It is I who should be thanking you. You've brought so much joy into my life." Mr. and Mrs. Johnson joined the embrace, enveloping both Chris and Mrs. Garcia in a group hug. The room was filled with sniffles and quiet sobs as they all shared in this moment of overwhelming gratitude and love. Officer Martinez stood to the side, watching the scene with a warm smile. He couldn't help but feel moved by the display of kindness and generosity before him. As they pulled apart, Chris looked up at Mrs. Garcia with red-rimmed eyes. "I promise I'll make you proud," he said earnestly. "I'll use this opportunity to help others, just like you and your husband did." Mrs. Garcia cupped Chris's face in her hands, her eyes twinkling with affection. "My dear, you've already made me prouder than I could have ever imagined," she said, her voice full of warmth. As the emotional moment subsided, Mrs. Garcia reached into her purse with trembling hands. She pulled out a small velvet box and held it gently, her eyes misting over with memories. "Chris," she said softly, "there's something else I'd like to give you." Chris looked at her curiously, his eyes still damp from tears. Mrs. Garcia opened the box, revealing a beautiful antique watch nestled inside. The gold face gleamed in the soft light of the living room, its hands ticking steadily. "This was my husband's most cherished possession, Mrs. Garcia explained, her voice filled with emotion. "He wore it every day of his service, and it became a symbol of his dedication to helping others." Chris's eyes widened as he realized the significance of the gift. He looked from the watch to Mrs. Garcia, then back to the watch again, unable to find words. Mrs. Garcia gently took the watch from its box and held it out to Chris. "I want you to have it," she said. "It's a reminder of the legacy of love and selflessness that you're now a part of." With shaking hands, Chris accepted the watch. He turned it over in his palms, marveling at its weight and the intricate engravings on the back. He could feel the history and love pulsing through it. "Mrs. Garcia, I don't know what to say," Chris stammered, overwhelmed by the gesture. "This is too much." Mrs. Garcia shook her head, smiling through her tears. "It's exactly right, my dear. You've shown the same kindness and selflessness that my husband did every day of his life. This watch belongs with you now." Chris carefully fastened the watch around his wrist, feeling its comforting weight. He looked up at Mrs. Garcia, his eyes shining with determination and gratitude. "I promise," he said solemnly, "I'll honor this gift. I'll wear it every day and remember the kindness and love it represents. I'll do my best to live up to the legacy it carries." Mrs. Garcia pulled Chris into another warm embrace, her heart swelling with pride and affection. "I know you will, my dear," she whispered. "I know you will." The Johnsons exchanged a meaningful glance, their hearts full of warmth and love for both Chris and Mrs. Garcia. "Mr. Johnson cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion as he prepared to speak. "Mrs. Garcia," he began, his tone gentle but filled with significance, "we've been thinking about something important." Mrs. Garcia looked up, her eyes still glistening with tears of joy. She tilted her head slightly, curiosity and anticipation shining in her gaze as she wondered what Mr. Johnson had to say. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, placing a gentle, comforting hand on Mrs. Garcia's shoulder. "We've seen how much joy you've brought into Chris's life and into ours," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "You've become such an important part of our family." Chris's eyes brightened, sensing where the conversation was heading. He looked from his parents to Mrs. Garcia, a hopeful smile spreading across his face, his heart racing with anticipation. "Mr. Johnson continued, his voice warm and sincere as he expressed the feelings that had been building in their hearts. "We'd like to ask you, Mrs. Garcia, if you'd consider becoming a permanent part of our family. We want you to know that you'll always have a place with us, not just as a neighbor or a friend, but as family." Mrs. Garcia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in surprise and disbelief. For a moment she was speechless, completely overwhelmed by the depth of the offer. You want me to be part of your family?" she asked, her voice trembling, barely above a whisper. Mrs. Johnson nodded, her own eyes brimming with tears. "Yes, we do. We'd be honored if you'd accept." Chris stepped forward, taking Mrs. Garcia's hand in his voice filled with earnestness and love. "Please say yes," he urged softly. You're already like a grandmother to me." "Mrs." Garcia looked around at the loving faces surrounding her. The warmth in their eyes, the sincerity in their voices, and the unconditional love they offered made her feel something she hadn't felt in years, a deep sense of belonging. Tears of joy streamed down her cheeks as she nodded, her heart overflowing with gratitude and love. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I would be honored to be a part of your family." The room seemed to glow with the warmth of the moment, the bond between them solidifying into something unbreakable. Chris, his parents, and Mrs. Garcia all embraced, their hearts intertwined by love, kindness, and the beautiful sense of family they had created together. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I'd love to be part of your family. You've given me so much already, and now this. I can't express how grateful I am." The Johnsons enveloped Mrs. Garcia in a warm group hug, with Chris in the middle, his arms wrapped tightly around his newfound grandmother. The room was filled with laughter and happy tears as they celebrated the beautiful expansion of their family. As the weeks turned into months, Chris found himself fueled by a renewed sense of purpose and determination. The love and support he received from his new grandmother, Mrs. Garcia, became a driving force in his life, pushing him to excel in school and beyond. Every afternoon after finishing his classes, Chris would rush over to Mrs. Garcia's house, eager to share his day's achievements with her. Mrs. Garcia's face would light up with joy each time Chris burst through her door, his backpack slung over one shoulder and a stack of books tucked under his arm. She would listen intently as he excitedly recounted his lessons, his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "Guess what?" Grandma Garcia Chris exclaimed one day, practically bouncing with excitement. "I got an A on my science project." Mrs. Garcia beamed with pride, her heart swelling with love for the boy who had become such an integral part of her life. "That's wonderful, Chris. I knew you could do it. Tell me all about your project." Chris launched into a detailed explanation of his experiment, his words tumbling out in a rush of excitement. Mrs. Garcia couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of pride and affection for this bright, hard-working boy who had brought so much joy and purpose into her life. The knowledge of the scholarship fund Mrs. Garcia had set up for him was a constant source of motivation for Chris. He understood the incredible opportunity he had been given, and he was determined to make the most of it. Late nights spent poring over textbooks and early mornings reviewing notes became routine, each effort a step toward his future. Chris's teachers quickly noticed the change in him. His hand was always the first to shoot up in class, eager to answer questions. His assignments, once average, now stood out for their depth and thoroughness. Even subjects that had previously been challenging became opportunities for growth, as Chris applied himself with a newfound resolve. One evening, as Chris sat at Mrs. Garcia's kitchen table, working diligently on his homework, she brought him a plate of warm cookies and a glass of milk. She watched him for a moment, her heart swelling with pride and affection as she observed his focused determination. "You know, Chris," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth, "your hard work is truly inspiring. You have such a bright future ahead of you." Chris looked up from his work, his face glowing with gratitude. "Thank you, Grandma Garcia," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I couldn't do it without you. You've given me so much more than just a place to study. You've given me the belief that I can achieve anything I set my mind to." Mrs. Garcia's eyes misted over as she placed a gentle hand on Chris's shoulder. "And you've given me the greatest gift of all, Chris, hope, love, and the joy of watching you grow into the amazing young man I always knew you could be." In that moment, the bond between them felt unbreakable, a testament to the power of love, kindness, and the unspoken understanding that they had both found something invaluable in each other. As Chris returned to his studies, the room was filled with a quiet, shared contentment, the kind that only comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong. Chris looked up from his textbook, a grateful smile spreading across his face. "It's all thanks to you, Grandma Garcia," he replied. "Your support and the scholarship fund make me want to do my very best." As the seasons changed, Mrs. Garcia became an inseparable part of the Johnson family. Her presence was a constant source of warmth, wisdom, and love, filling their home with an abundance of laughter and shared moments. She was more than just a neighbor or a friend, she was family. One crisp autumn afternoon, Mrs. Garcia sat proudly in the bleachers at Chris's school, her eyes twinkling with pride as she watched him take center stage at the science fair. Chris's project, a meticulously crafted model of renewable energy sources, stood proudly on display as he passionately explained his work to the judges. The complexity of his project was a testament to his dedication, and Mrs. Garcia couldn't help but beam with pride. Leaning forward, she whispered to the woman sitting next to her, "That's my grandson," her voice brimming with joy and pride. Later that evening, the Johnson family gathered around their dinner table to celebrate Chris's first-place ribbon. The aroma of a homemade feast filled the air as they ate, and Mrs. Garcia regaled them with stories of her late husband's adventures on the police force. Chris listened with wide eyes, his imagination painting vivid pictures of bravery and dedication, inspired by the tales of courage and service. As the school year progressed, Mrs. Garcia became a familiar and beloved face at parent-teacher conferences and school events. She sat proudly beside Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, beaming with pride as Chris's teachers praised his hard work and remarkable improvement. Her presence was a quiet but powerful testament to the impact she had on Chris's life. On weekday afternoons, Mrs. Garcia's kitchen table became the hub of learning. She sat patiently beside Chris, helping him with his homework and sharing her own experiences to make his lessons come alive. Her stories about living through the Great Depression made history leap off the pages, turning dry facts into vivid narratives. Her practical knowledge of fractions, honed through years of adjusting recipes, made even the most daunting math problems seem manageable. "You know, Chris, Mrs. Garcia said one day as they pored over his social studies textbook, "When I was your age, we didn't have all these fancy gadgets. We had to learn things the old-fashioned way." Chris looked up, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Really? How did you manage?" Mrs. Garcia chuckled, her laughter warm and infectious, and launched into a story about her school days that had Chris giggling and asking for more. As winter approached, the Johnsons made a heartfelt decision. They invited Mrs. Garcia to move into their spare room, wanting her to be even more a part of their daily lives. The invitation brought tears to her eyes, and she accepted with a heart full of gratitude and love. From that day on, every morning began with the comforting aroma of Mrs. Garcia's famous pancakes filling the house, and every evening ended with the family gathered in the living room, sharing stories and laughter that bound them even closer together. As the winter months passed, Chris and Mrs. Garcia's bond grew stronger with each passing day. Their afternoons together became a cherished ritual, filled with laughter, learning, and deep conversations. It was during these moments that Chris realized just how much Mrs. Garcia had become a part of his life, a constant source of inspiration, love, and wisdom. One snowy afternoon, as they sat by the fireplace, sipping hot cocoa, Mrs. Garcia's eyes twinkled with a hint of mischief. She leaned in, her voice warm with affection and a touch of nostalgia. "You know, Chris," she began, "when I was your age, I dreamed of becoming a famous chef." Chris's eyes widened in surprise. "Really?" "I didn't know that," he exclaimed, his interest piqued. Mrs. Garcia smiled, the memories of her childhood dreams dancing in her mind. "Oh yes," she said with a chuckle. "I used to spend hours in the kitchen, pretending I was on a cooking show, creating all sorts of recipes. Some of them were actually pretty good, if I do say so myself." Chris grinned, imagining a young Mrs. Garcia bustling around a kitchen, her apron too big for her tiny frame. "I had no idea. You should teach me some of those recipes," he suggested eagerly. "Mrs." Garcia's smile grew even wider. "I would love that, Chris. How about we start with my famous apple pie? It's a family recipe, and I think you'll enjoy learning it." Chris nodded enthusiastically, already looking forward to their next culinary adventure. The thought of learning to cook from his grandma Garcia filled him with excitement, knowing that these moments would create memories he'd cherish forever. As they sat by the fire, the snow gently falling outside, the warmth in the room was palpable, not just from the crackling flames, but from the love and connection that had grown between them. It was a bond that transcended generations, built on shared experiences, mutual respect, and the understanding that they had found in each other something truly special. "Mrs." Garcia's eyes softened, a bittersweet smile curling on her lips as she allowed herself to be swept back in time. "Oh, absolutely. I spent countless hours by my mother's side in the kitchen, soaking up every bit of knowledge she had to offer, learning each of her closely guarded recipes. The kitchen was our sanctuary, a place where I felt the warmth of her love in every stir of the pot, every pinch of spice. Those moments were more than just cooking, they were the heartbeats of our shared life, passed down through generations." Chris leaned in closer, his interest piqued, eager to know more about this hidden chapter of her life. "What happened to that dream of yours?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity and concern. "Mrs." Garcia's voice grew softer, almost tender as she replied, "Life happened, my dear. I met your grandfather, fell hopelessly in love, and discovered a new dream in the life we built together. It wasn't planned, but it felt right, like everything was falling into place. Creating a life that was richer and more fulfilling than anything I had ever imagined." Chris absorbed her words, his young mind processing the weight of her decision. After a thoughtful pause, he asked, "Do you ever wish you had become a chef?" "Mrs." Garcia shook her head with quiet conviction, a serene smile gracing her face. "Not for a single moment," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Sometimes our dreams evolve, and that's perfectly okay. The life I shared with your grandfather, building our home, raising our family, it was a dream far more beautiful and fulfilling than anything I could have envisioned on my own. I wouldn't trade those years for the world." Moved by Mrs. Garcia's story, Chris felt a surge of inspiration and began to open up about his own aspirations. He spoke passionately about his dream of becoming an inventor, of creating things that would not only change lives but also make the world a better place. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he painted a picture of the future he hoped to build. Mrs. Garcia listened with rapt attention, her heart swelling with pride. The love she felt for this young boy was profound, and she knew deep down that he was destined for greatness. "You have such a big heart, Chris," she said warmly, reaching out to clasp his hand in hers. "I have no doubt that you will accomplish extraordinary things. The world is a better place just knowing you're in it." As the weeks turned into months, their conversations grew deeper, more meaningful. Chris found in Mrs. Garcia a confidante, someone with whom he could share his deepest fears and insecurities, things he sometimes found difficult to discuss with his parents. In turn, Mrs. Garcia opened up about her own life struggles, recounting stories of hardship, resilience, and perseverance that left Chris in awe and filled him with newfound strength and determination. With every story exchanged, their bond strengthened. Chris marveled at Mrs. Garcia's inner strength, her wisdom forged through years of experience, while Mrs. Garcia was continuously amazed by Chris's kindness, his boundless curiosity, and the depth of his compassion. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, working on a jigsaw puzzle, the warm glow of the lamp casting a soft light over their work, Chris looked up at Mrs. Garcia with a serious, contemplative expression. "You know, Mrs. Garcia," he began, his voice soft but sincere, "I'm really glad you're part of our family now." Mrs. Garcia's eyes instantly welled up with tears, her heart overflowing with joy and gratitude. "Oh, Chris," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "you have no idea how much that means to me. You've brought so much light and happiness into my life, more than I ever thought possible." In that moment, the depth of their connection was undeniable. It was a bond, not just of love and family, but of shared dreams, mutual respect, and the profound understanding that they had both found something incredibly special in each other. As spring approached, Chris found himself grappling with a daunting school project. His teacher had assigned the class to create a presentation about a significant historical event and its impact on modern society. Chris felt overwhelmed, unsure of where to begin or how to approach such a complex task. One afternoon, as he sat at Mrs. Garcia's kitchen table, his brow furrowed in concentration, Mrs. Garcia noticed his distress. "What's troubling you, dear?" she asked gently, setting a plate of freshly baked cookies in front of him. Chris sighed, pushing his textbook away. "It's this big project for school," he explained. "I just don't know how to make it interesting or where to start." Mrs. Garcia's eyes lit up. "Oh, history. That was always my favorite subject," she said, pulling up a chair beside him. "What's the project about?" As Chris described the assignment, Mrs. Garcia listened intently. When he finished, she smiled warmly. "You know, this reminds me of a project I did when I was about your age," she began, her voice taking on a storytelling quality that instantly captured Chris's attention. Mrs. Garcia shared how she had struggled with a similar assignment until her grandfather helped her see history as a collection of real people's stories rather than just dates and facts. She described how she had brought her presentation to life by focusing on personal accounts and everyday objects from the time period. Inspired by Mrs. Garcia's story, Chris's eyes began to sparkle with newfound enthusiasm. "That's so cool," he exclaimed. "I never thought about history that way before." Encouraged by his reaction, Mrs. Garcia continued to share more experiences from her past. She told Chris about the creative ways she had tackled difficult school projects, emphasizing the importance of thinking outside the box and approaching challenges with confidence. As they talked, Chris began to jot down ideas, his earlier frustration replaced by excitement. Mrs. Garcia watched him with pride, offering gentle guidance and encouragement as he worked. "Remember, Chris," she said softly, "every great achievement starts with believing in yourself. You have wonderful ideas and a kind heart. Let that shine through in your project." Chris nodded, feeling a surge of confidence. With Mrs. Garcia's insights and his own creativity, he knew he could create something truly special. As he continued to brainstorm, Chris felt grateful for Mrs. Garcia's wisdom and support, realizing once again how lucky he was to have her in his life. With Mrs. Garcia's guidance and his newfound enthusiasm, Chris threw himself into his school project. He spent hours researching, crafting, and perfecting his presentation. The days flew by as he worked tirelessly, fueled by his passion and the encouragement of his newfound grandmother. On the day of the presentation, Chris stood before his class with confidence. His project, a vivid and engaging exploration of the civil rights movement, captivated his classmates and teacher alike. He used personal stories and everyday objects to bring the era to life, just as Mrs. Garcia had suggested. As Chris spoke, his voice filled with passion and understanding. His teacher's eyes widened with surprise and delight, and his classmates listened intently, drawn in by the unique approach he had taken. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. "Chris, that was exceptional," his teacher exclaimed, beaming with pride. "Your presentation truly brought history to life. I've never seen such a creative and engaging approach from a student your age." Chris's cheeks flushed with pride as his classmates chimed in with their own compliments. He felt a warmth spreading through his chest, knowing that he had done well. Later that day, as Chris burst through the door of Mrs. Garcia's house, his face alight with excitement. "Mrs. Garcia, Mrs. Garcia," he called out, barely able to contain his joy. "I did it. My project was a huge success." Mrs. Garcia's face lit up with delight as Chris recounted every detail of his presentation and the praise he had received. She listened intently, her eyes brimming with pride and affection. "Oh, Chris," she said, pulling him into a warm hug. "I'm so proud of you. But remember, this success is all yours. You did the hard work." Chris shook his head, his eyes serious. "No, Mrs. Garcia, I couldn't have done it without you. Your stories and advice made all the difference. You helped me see history in a whole new way." Mrs. Garcia's eyes glistened with tears of joy. She patted Chris's hand gently, feeling a surge of love for this remarkable young boy who had brought so much light into her life. As the days passed, Mrs. Garcia began sharing more stories about her late husband, Officer Garcia. She spoke of his unwavering commitment to justice, his kindness toward others, and his belief in the power of community. Chris listened intently, his young mind soaking up every word. One sunny afternoon, as they sat on Mrs. Garcia's porch, she held her husband's badge in her wrinkled hands. "You know, Chris," she began, her voice soft with memory, "Henry always said that true strength comes from helping others." Chris leaned in, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Really? How did he help people?" Mrs. Garcia smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, in so many ways. He'd go out of his way to help a lost child find their parent or buy a meal for someone who couldn't afford it. He believed that every small act of kindness could change the world." Chris nodded thoughtfully, mulling over her words. "That's amazing, Mrs. Garcia. I want to be like that too." "You already are, dear Mrs. Garcia said, patting his hand. "Your kindness to me is proof of that, but there's always more we can do." Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Garcia continued to share her husband's principles with Chris. She told him about the importance of honesty, the value of hard work, and the need for empathy in all aspects of life. Chris took these lessons to heart. At school, he started standing up for kids who were being bullied. At home, he helped his parents more without being asked. And in the neighborhood, he looked for ways to lend a hand, just like Officer Garcia used to do. One day, Chris spotted old Mr. Jenkins struggling with his groceries. Without hesitation, he rushed over to help. As they walked to Mr. Jenkins' house, Chris thought about how proud Mrs. Garcia and Officer Garcia would be. Later, when he told Mrs. Garcia about it, her eyes welled up with tears of joy. "Oh, Chris," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "Henry would have been so proud of you. You're carrying on his legacy in the most beautiful way." Chris felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. He realized that through Mrs. Garcia's stories and lessons, Officer Garcia's spirit lived on, and now it was a part of him too. Chris's heart raced with excitement as he stepped into the bustling community center. The colorful posters on the walls and the cheerful chatter of volunteers filled him with a sense of purpose. He remembered Mrs. Garcia's stories about her late husband's dedication to helping others, and he felt inspired to follow in those footsteps. The center's coordinator, Ms. Thompson, greeted Chris with a warm smile. "Welcome, Chris. We're so glad to have you here. Are you ready to make a difference?" Chris nodded eagerly. "Yes, Ma, I am. I want to help in any way I can." Ms. Thompson showed Chris around the center, explaining the various programs they offered. There was a food bank, after-school tutoring, and even a small library. Chris's eyes widened as he realized how many ways there were to help people in his community. For his first task, Chris was assigned to help sort donations for the food bank. He carefully organized cans and boxes, making sure everything was in its proper place. As he worked, he thought about how each item would help feed a family in need. It made him feel good inside, knowing he was making a real difference. Over the next few weeks, Chris became a regular face at the community center. He helped with homework in the after-school program, read stories to younger kids in the library, and even assisted in organizing a neighborhood cleanup day. One afternoon, as Chris was helping an elderly man choose books from the library shelves, he overheard Miss Thompson talking to another volunteer. "That Chris is something special," she said. "He reminds me of Officer Garcia, always ready to lend a hand, always with a smile on his face." Chris felt a surge of pride at the comparison. He was living up to the example set by Mrs. Garcia's husband, and it felt amazing. As the weeks turned into months, Chris found himself looking forward to his time at the community center more and more. The sense of fulfillment he got from helping others was unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. He loved seeing the grateful smiles on people's faces and knowing that he had made their day just a little bit brighter. One day, after a particularly busy afternoon at the center, Chris sat down with Mrs. Garcia to share his experiences. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he told her about all the ways he was helping people. Mrs. Garcia listened intently, her face beaming with pride. "Oh, Chris," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You're doing exactly what Henry would have wanted. You're making this world a better place, one small act of kindness at a time." Chris trudged home from school, his shoulders slumped and his head hanging low. He had just received his math test results, and the big red D at the top of the page felt like a punch to his stomach. As he walked through his front door, he could barely muster a greeting to his parents before heading straight to his room. Later that evening, Chris sat on Mrs. Garcia's porch, staring at his feet. He had come over for their usual chat, but he couldn't bring himself to share his disappointment. Mrs. Garcia noticed the change in Chris's demeanor immediately. "What's troubling you, son?" she asked gently, her warm brown eyes filled with concern. Chris sighed heavily. "I failed my math test, Mrs. Garcia," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I studied so hard, but I just couldn't get it. Maybe I'm not as smart as everyone thinks I am." Mrs. Garcia's heart ached for the boy she had come to love as her own grandson. She reached out and patted his hand softly. "Oh, Chris," she said, her voice full of understanding. "Everyone faces setbacks sometimes. It doesn't mean you're not smart or capable." Chris looked up at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Really?" Mrs. Garcia nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Let me tell you a story about Henry and me," she began. "When we were first married, Henry was studying to become a police officer. He struggled with some of the written exams, just like you're struggling with math now." Chris listened intently as Mrs. Garcia continued. "Henry was so discouraged, he thought about giving up his dream. But we faced it together. We studied every night, made flashcards, and even turned it into a game. It wasn't easy, but Henry didn't give up." "What happened?" Chris asked, his curiosity piqued. "Well, Henry passed his exams with flying colors, Mrs. Garcia said proudly, and he went on to become one of the best officers in the precinct. The key was persistence and not being afraid to ask for help." Chris felt a glimmer of hope stirring in his chest. "So you think I can do better next time?" Mrs. Garcia squeezed his hand. "I know you can, son. And remember, Henry and I didn't face that challenge alone. We had each other. You have me, your parents, and your teachers. Don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it." With Mrs. Garcia's words of encouragement ringing in his ears, Chris felt a renewed sense of determination. He took a deep breath and nodded, his eyes shining with newfound resolve. "You're right, Mrs. Garcia," he said, his voice stronger now. "I won't give up. I'll try harder and ask for help when I need it." Mrs. Garcia beamed at him, her face radiating pride. "That's the spirit, son. Now, why don't we start by looking at that math test of yours? Maybe we can figure out where you went wrong together." Chris hesitated for a moment, then reached into his backpack and pulled out the crumpled test paper. As they went through the problems one by one, Mrs. Garcia patiently explained the concepts Chris had struggled with. She used simple, everyday examples to make the math more relatable, just as she and Henry had done years ago. Over the next few weeks, Chris threw himself into his studies with renewed vigor. He stayed after school for extra help from his math teacher, worked on practice problems with Mrs. Garcia, and even asked his parents to quiz him at dinner time. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments when he felt like giving up, but he remembered Mrs. Garcia's story about Henry and pushed through. When the next math test rolled around, Chris felt nervous but prepared. As he worked through the problems, he could almost hear Mrs. Garcia's gentle voice guiding him. When he finally turned in his paper, he felt a sense of accomplishment, regardless of the outcome. A few days later, Chris burst into Mrs. Garcia's house, waving his test paper in the air. "I did it, Mrs. Garcia," he exclaimed, his face split into a wide grin. "I got a B, Mrs. Garcia's eyes welled up with happy tears as she hugged Chris tightly. "Oh, my son, I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You see, with hard work and perseverance, you can overcome anything." Chris nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that was more than just satisfaction from mastering a difficult subject. This experience had taught him invaluable lessons that extended far beyond the walls of his classroom. He had learned the true meaning of perseverance, the courage to ask for help when needed, and the incredible impact of having people who genuinely believed in him. As he sat beside Mrs. Garcia, sharing in his triumph, Chris felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the strong support system in his life. He realized that these moments sitting in the quiet company of someone who cared deeply for him were what truly mattered. As the sun began its descent, casting a warm, golden glow through Mrs. Garcia's living room window, the two of them settled comfortably on the couch. The soft hum of the television filled the background, but neither paid it any mind. Their focus was entirely on each other, wrapped in the peaceful silence that spoke volumes more than words ever could. Chris glanced down at the watch on his wrist, a treasured keepsake that had once belonged to Mrs. Garcia's late husband. He gently ran his fingers over its smooth, worn surface, feeling the weight of its history and the deep sense of responsibility that came with it. This watch was far more than a gift. It was a powerful symbol of the trust, love, and unbreakable bond that had developed between them over the past few months. Noticing Chris's thoughtful gesture, Mrs. Garcia smiled softly. She reached out and took his hand in hers, her wrinkled fingers intertwining with his youthful ones. The contrast between their hands, one aged and weathered by time, the other full of life and potential, was stark, yet beautifully symbolic of the bridge their friendship had built across generations. "You know, my son, Mrs. Garcia began, her voice warm and tinged with emotion. "When Henry passed away, I thought my days of feeling truly happy were behind me. But you've brought the sunshine back into my life." A lump formed in Chris's throat, and he squeezed Mrs. Garcia's hand gently, feeling the weight of her words settle deep within him. "And you've changed my life too, Mrs. Garcia," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You've taught me so much about kindness and what it really means to be there for someone." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them overwhelmed by the depth of their connection. The rhythmic ticking of the watch on Chris's wrist seemed to echo the beating of their hearts, perfectly in sync despite the years that separated them. As they sat there, hand in hand, the true impact of their relationship became crystal clear. What had started as a simple act of kindness, a young boy offering help to an elderly neighbor with a broken TV, had blossomed into something far more profound and life-changing for both of them. This was a bond that transcended age, a connection forged through shared experiences, mutual respect, and unconditional love. Tears welled up in Mrs. Garcia's eyes as she looked at Chris. In him, she saw not only the grandson she had never had, but also a bright, hopeful future filled with compassion and empathy. And Chris, as he gazed back at Mrs. Garcia, saw a woman full of wisdom, boundless love, and a living example of the kind of person he aspired to become. Have you ever formed an unexpected bond like Chris and Mrs. Garcia? Yes or no? Let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to my channel. I am spending countless hours writing these heartwarming stories for you, and your support is what keeps me going. Wow, what an incredible story. Chris and Mrs. Garcia's bond shows us just how powerful kindness and compassion can be. It reminds us that sometimes the most unexpected connections can bring the most profound joy and meaning into our lives. As you've watched their journey, what have you learned? What's one lesson from this story that you'll bring into your own life? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear how this story has inspired you. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support means the world to me, and it helps me continue creating these heartwarming stories for you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.